this time, I'd like to introduce Glenn Martin. A little bit of background on Glenn Martin. He is currently the Vice President of Development and Public Affairs and Director of the David Rothberg Center for Public Policy and Fortune Society, Inc., a nonprofit organization devoted to the successful reentry and reintegration of individuals with criminal histories. In these roles, Mr. Martin is responsible for developing and advancing Fortune's criminal justice policy advocacy agenda and providing leadership over the agency's development and communication units. Mr. Martin works to create partnerships with other advocates and policymakers to advance criminal justice policy reforms that serve to remove practical and statutory roadblocks facing people who are working to reintegrate into society. One look at Glenn Martin's background, you can see this is a good man with a lot of credentials, a lot of work in the field, and after a 6-year New York State prison sentence has really turned his life around and really done a lot for the state of New York. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Glenn Martin.
I really appreciate the opportunity to serve as the keynote speaker. I find it to be a distinct honor, especially at an event about social justice, and the fact that we're starting out talking about the criminal justice system, something I know a lot about from a personal experience and from professional experience. I'd like to congratulate the students who had a vision for this conference and who did the hard work to pull it together. Today obviously is a day for unleashing the power of the personal story. I'm not often asked to tell my personal story, my individual narrative. In fact, many times it's something that I actually leave out of the conversation because of all the stigma associated with it and the work that I do and the need to inspire people across the political spectrum. In fact, it was just a few years ago that I was here working with Andrew Clark and other folks at Central Connecticut State University around a provisional pardon bill, and I remember coming to testify in front of the legislature and giving my sort of professional experience around the creation of provisional pardons in other states. And I remember walking away and having a legislator walk up to me and say to me, what law school did you go to? And I just sort of smiled a bit and just thought about how ironic it was that if I would have started out talking about the 6 years I did in prison, that legislator may not have even paid much attention during my testimony about those provisional pardons. And I'm glad to say that it became law here in Connecticut and that you guys are currently working to expand on it and strengthen that particular law. So today I will tell my personal story. I'll tell a little bit about my journey, and I'll tell a bit about the stories of others that has helped to inspire me in the work that I've done over the last 10 years since I left prison. So I've been blessed to have a career that has afforded me the opportunity to meet a number of very influential figures. In 2011, for instance, I had the chance to talk to hip-hop mogul Russell Simmons at a nonprofit fundraising event. And we talked a bit about his rise to the top and what it took to get him there and how he invested in himself to extricate himself from poverty and become who he is today. And we talked more interestingly for me about the need for drug law reform because it's something he cares deeply about. In New York State, for 36 years, we had laws called the Rockefeller drug laws, which were our mandatory minimum drug laws. And unfortunately, we set the pace for the rest of the country in creating those tough on crime drug laws, which 36 years later clearly was one of the most failed criminal justice policies in the United States. And I'm pleased to say that Russell Simmons was part of helping us to overturn those laws after 36 years. And we're hoping that the same way we led the country in creating these laws is the same way we'll hopefully lead the country in undoing these mandatory minimums that have served to decimate communities of color and treat people who are addicted to drugs as criminals instead of having a conversation that's couched in public health. We often take the use of drugs and have that conversation in the criminal justice arena, and the outcomes that we've seen, many social justice advocates could have predicted years ago. In fact, the agency I work for is led by a gentleman named David Rothenberg, who started this work 44 years ago. And I remember we had an opportunity to do an op-ed in the New York Times at around the time when all the stars were aligning to undo those drug laws. And the New York Times said, you guys, we need this, in the next 24 hours, like everyone else in media. There was an immediate deadline. And I'm thinking to myself, my God, we have to write this in the next few minutes. Let's get this out the door. And what I did was, honestly, and quite sadly, was to go back to an op-ed that David had wrote 30-something years earlier, where he pretty much predicted everything that was going to happen in terms of the disproportionate impact on people of color, communities of color, and the criminalization of people who have addiction issues, and really just revamped that op-ed and used it, and it was quite fitting, unfortunately. But it said a lot about the vision of people who care about social justice and who look into the future and think about our current policies and how they're going to impact us in the long run, because unfortunately criminal justice policy in the United States is very reactionary, and rarely has the sort of evidence-based, practice that we all seek out in other areas of life. Very emotionally driven, unfortunately. How many times have you seen a heinous crime in the paper and then the next day some elected official is standing up saying, I have an answer for that. I have a bill that says this or it says that. And you really don't see the impact of that until much later on. But when you're in the middle of it, and you're in the middle of all the emotions surrounding what might have been a heinous crime, it's easy for people to sign on to those things without giving it a lot of thought. And there are many other people who unfortunately will not stand up and say, no, this is not the right thing to do. Yes, that was a heinous crime, but this is not how we're going to increase public safety. And so thank you for allowing me to be in a room full of social justice advocates that are always a step ahead of everyone else and really thinking down the line. I'm looking at my colleague from Fortune Society. She's saying, that is not the speech we prepared. So in 2009, in 2010, I had the chance to speak at Harvard University. And the keynote speaker there was Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. And I remember I was on a panel, but I remember her speaking as the keynote, and they had the microphones in the middle of the aisle. And I remember, wow, how often in life do you get a chance to ask a Supreme Court justice a question, especially if you do criminal justice advocacy work. And I remember walking up to the microphone. I remember my legs shaking a bit, and I'm saying, okay, you have to couch the question properly, and it was something I really cared about, something I really did want to hear from the Supreme Court justice about. It was around what we call collateral consequences, the idea that if you're convicted of a crime, there are direct consequences, right? You go to prison for 2 to 4 years, or 6 years, or 10 years, or you get sentenced to probation. But then there are collateral consequences, the punishment that's imposed upon people who are convicted of crimes by entities outside of the court. And I remember I wanted to ask her what her thoughts were about the collateral consequences of criminal convictions and its disproportionate impact on people and communities of color. And I got up there and I asked that question. I waited, and I felt as though I've been waiting my whole life for the answer to that question from someone so prominent. And she looked down in the audience and said, collateral consequences? What are those? Wow. Yeah, it was hugely impactful, but I'm happy to say that the next day, I got up early to go to breakfast. I remember very early, 5:15 in the morning, and she was there having breakfast, preparing for that day of panels. And we had a chance to sit and talk, and we talked about collateral consequences, and I was better able to explain to her what I meant by it. And I think she walked away from it with a renewed understanding of how the criminal justice system not just impacts people in terms of direct consequences, but unfortunately creates a lifetime worth of consequences. In 2009, I'm never going to get through the speech. In 2009, I had a chance to have lunch with Richard Gere and his wife at John Jay College in New York. And he's a Buddhist, and he was thinking about the teachings of Buddha and mass incarceration in the United States. And he was wondering how we could use the teachings of Buddha to inform the criminal justice system here in the United States and maybe change the way we engage in criminal justice policy. In 2008, I had the chance to meet actor and director Charles Dutton, and he spent time in prison himself. And he always jokes that he went from jail to Yale because he really did graduate from Yale after he did time in prison. I think it was 5 years. But he talked to me about the discrimination that he still faces based on his criminal record. You know, here's this very accomplished actor, has been in many, many movies, over 100 films, has directed movies. And he talked about how when he goes to Canada, he's denied admissions based on his criminal record. And when he is given admission, it's under very stringent and tight criteria based on having a criminal record. In 2007, I was at an event and I met Spike Lee, and we had a conversation. And we talked about his rise and what inspired him to make some of the movies he's made and to touch on these issues in his movies. And he asked me questions about recidivism and why people continue to cycle through the criminal justice system. And I hope I was able to help inform his thinking about why people recidivate and go back to prison, because at the agency I work for, the Fortune Society, for us, one of our policies is that we accept any person back into our program, even if they've failed out of our program, because relapse is part of recovery. And when you're trying to change a lifetime worth of behavior, you have to leave room for the fact that people may screw up, right? You don't do a 6-month program and assume you've reduced recidivism. That's just not how it works. Think of a lifetime worth of behavior you might have engaged in, whether it's smoking cigarette or some other addiction you might have, and imagine if 6 months later you need to totally stop that behavior. So hopefully I was able to inform his thinking. In 2006, someone perhaps less popular, but I ended up on a flight from DC to New York with Robert Rubin, who used to be the US Secretary of Treasury here in the United States. And my questions for him were around how a person so wealthy could even fathom what it's like for poor people and people involved in the criminal justice system. And I learned a lot from him. I learned that a person does not have to necessarily have been impacted by the system, although I would argue everyone is impacted by it in one way or another, but you don't have to be directly impacted by it to bring a social justice passion to this work, right? People come to this work for many different reasons, and it helped me to embrace the people who come to the table to help with this work after having that conversation with Mr. Rubin. So each of these amazing encounters left a significant impact on me and helped to shape the direction of my career. But it was a brief meeting in 1995 with someone whose name I honestly never caught that changed the direction of my entire life. This person not only saved me from personal destruction, but their words lit a social justice fire in my gut that burns to this day and may never be extinguished. This person grabbed my wrist as I was free falling into an abyss of despair and reminded me that our destiny is not one that's written for us, but one that's written by us. In 1995, I was at the beginning of a 6-year prison sentence in New York State for armed robbery. As the story typically goes for people who are involved in the criminal justice system, it wasn't long before I found my face pressed against the cold, filthy prison floor of a police precinct in New York City. And it was the beginning of a journey that would last for 6 years and culminate in the cold, bitter mountains in Attica, New York. I remember chuckling at the irony of discovering that there were farms in New York State while I was shackled in the back of a bus with 46 other men on our way to be delivered to a prison like cattle. As human farms, as it were. The human spirit is resilient and the human body is adaptable. So I prepared for what I knew would be the most depressing and uneventful 6 years of my own life. But life had other plans for me, as it usually does, right? And something extraordinary happened for me within the first few weeks of arriving at the prison. In a place that I decided could only yield nothing positive, I met a correctional counselor who placed his hand on my shoulder and leaned over and said to me in a hushed tone, he said, "I saw your GED test scores and you should go to college." I looked up at him with what we call the prison face, the face that you use to survive in the criminal justice system. And I thought he was making a malicious joke. He went on to explain to me that he himself was brought up on a farm in rural New York State, and how higher education had liberated him from what was a generationally inherited farm work, something he dreaded, something he didn't want to do for the rest of his life. He told me that in many ways our stories of growing up in New York were a lot alike, except that when he was stopped by the police for driving a stolen car, the color of his skin helped to replace the word stolen with borrowed. Unauthorized use of a motor vehicle became harmless joyriding. He told me that after going to college, he developed a desire to pay it forward. He saw himself as a soldier in the social justice fight, but one who fought the beast from within its belly. He went on to inform me that the correctional facility had a college program. And before that day, no one had ever challenged me to further my education. Imagine that. Someone in a position of authority, someone who I respected, someone who could just as easily have ignored my own humanity. someone who had obviously known the value of education in changing lives, someone who knew the value of the personal story, someone who saw that we were more alike than different, someone who believed in social justice, took the time to point out the potential that he observed in me. I never did catch his name, but I adopted his passion for social justice and reminded myself that to whom much is given, much is required. So that evening, I took the details of that brief but impactful conversation back to my cell, and his words kept playing in my head like a broken record. I searched deep inside of myself for the courage to apply for the college program. It wasn't easy to motivate myself when everything else in my circumference reminded me that I was a failure. But I decided to take the entrance exam, and the short version of the story is that I walked out of prison after having earned a quality, life-altering liberal arts degree from Canisius University. What I learned throughout my studies is that poverty and addiction are treated as incurable diseases in the United States, and our prisons are the fear-driven quarantine facilities that allow us all to sleep at night. But they're not solutions. While reentry mania has created renewed momentum for progressive criminal justice reform advocates, it's a downstream strategy. For every body we're able to pluck out of the river and save, thousands of others are swept away. In the next 25 years, we must think and act more boldly and recognize that mass incarceration and criminal record barriers will be judged by our children as an indelible stain on our generation's legacy. Criminal record-based discrimination is a surrogate for race-based discrimination. It is today's civil rights issue and deserves a fitting social justice response. The United States currently has the highest documented incarceration rate and highest total prison population in the world. We have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prison population. The magnitude of incarceration and the stark disparity in rates of incarceration by race means that a black man in this country has a 1 in 3 chance of being incarcerated before the age of 21. While women are incarcerated at lower rates, the rate of incarceration for women of color has been on the rise in recent years. To our shame, these rates do not correlate with criminal behavior along racial lines and reflect a deep-rooted injustice. In addition, the story we don't tell ourselves is the one about who is most likely to be a victim of violent crime in the United States. Instead, we litter the Office of Victim Services with posters and literature that contain no indication of the Bureau of Justice Statistics supported fact that it is young black men who are the majority of victims in the United States. And we wonder why black men take that victimization and trauma and turn it into anger, rage, and the ability to victimize others. We as a society have made and continue to make a deliberate choice to address a history of poverty, neglect, racism, and classism by creating penal codes rather than addressing these fundamental inequities. As one segment of America is taught to learn and earn, another segment of society gets stopped and frisked. While there's been some measurable progress in recent years, including the passage of the Second Chance Act and the successful reduction of crack cocaine sentencing disparities, the nation has schizophrenically persisted in tough on crime policies. Furthermore, our nation's thirst for punishment and revenge does not end when people leave prison. There are 700,000 people due to be released from incarceration this year, and try as they may to reintegrate into mainstream society, these individuals will face a maze of policies and regulations that keep them from accessing the very things they need to rebuild their lives and become functioning members of society. Legal and statutory restrictions, inadvertent and deliberate discrimination practices, and the cultural stigma associated with having a criminal record restrict formerly incarcerated people from filling their basic needs. The story of a woman I work to assist shortly after coming home from prison is illustrative. After 32 arrests for drug possession and prostitution, Teresa had decided to change her life. Within 5 years, she earned her GED on Rikers Island and overcame her drug addiction. She did not stop there. She went on to earn her undergraduate degree at Baruch College and a master's degree in social work at New York University. She put these hard-earned credentials to work at a social service agency where she helped others to regain their lives and their dignity. Teresa was great at her job, and her supervisor promoted her to a managerial position, a role that required a social work license in the state of New York. Teresa applied for the license and was denied because of her criminal history. After years of taking the positive, affirmative steps she was told would change her life and giving back to society, she was told she lacked good moral character. The state of New York got it wrong. The state's effort to further punish Teresa amounted to a loss for society as a whole. Teresa was lucky in that she was even able to access higher education. Individuals currently in prison are unfortunately no longer eligible for Pell Grants. Other legal barriers include barriers in accessing public housing, employment, and the right to vote. When people come home from prison and they fail to reintegrate, they are not the only ones who suffer. Much of American society is impacted by the consequences of over-incarceration as hundreds of thousands return each year to millions of family members, many of whom are already burdened by poverty and neglect. Every year there's an exponential impact as valuable lives are wasted, communities are strained, the public is less safe, and dreams are deferred. In the 2004 State of the Union address, President George Bush provided a ray of hope and transcended traditional partisan rhetoric when he announced his prisoner reentry initiative and declared that, quote, "America is the land of second chance, and when the gates of the prison open, the path ahead should lead to a better life." That important pronunciation led to a number of meaningful shifts in the distribution of scarce resources and in local and national policy. It's the only thing he ever said that I liked. Bipartisan dialogue in Congress culminated in the passage of the Second Chance Act. States and localities adopted reentry as a critical component of efforts to increase public safety, and many jurisdictions started to revisit the myriad collateral consequences that serve to alienate and unfairly diminish opportunities for people. Over the 8 years since that important speech, reentry mania has swept across our country, as people hoped reentry programs might cure our country's addiction to mass incarceration. Bipartisan attention to reentry was inspiring. It could have signaled a tipping point on the way to a redefined, race-neutral, and equitable criminal justice system in America, one that viewed victimization and subsequent incarceration as not just the failure of the defendant, but also as a failure of society. But reentry programs, if not combined with front-end strategies, rely on the banks downstream to collect and mend the bodies of young, poor, Black, and Latino men and women who are chewed up and spit out by our unforgiving criminal justice system. We need to march upstream. In the same communities in which stakeholders have embraced a new focus on reentry, policing, prosecution, and incarceration policies remain racialized and class biased. For example, law enforcement's approach to certain communities designated as high crime is often fear-driven, short-sighted, and sends a strong message about the devaluation of the residents of those communities. These communities are composed of residents who could help law enforcement to maintain safety, but instead are seen as threats and stopped regularly and frisked. These policing strategies reinforce and feed mass incarceration and play into centuries of storytelling about the legitimization of racism by law enforcement. Over the next 25 years, we must take on this bigger upstream challenge, even at a time when we're at a critical juncture and risk backsliding. It is important that as we fight to sustain and build on the reentry momentum, we demand that reentry be a concern at all junctures of the criminal justice system. At sentencing, we must ask our judges, and then what? When the head of our police department decides that aggressive policing is the way to public safety, we must ask him or her, and then what? When our governors tinker around the edges by right-sizing prisons instead of downsizing the system, we must ask them, and then what? We should all ask ourselves the question and begin our next 25 years of criminal justice advocacy by first marching upstream. If not, the ultimate indictment will come from our children. I encourage you to keep taking big, courageous, fearless social justice leaps and have faith that you'll successfully build the wings on your way down. Remember, as you leave this conference and prepare to advocate for fairness and equity in the world, whether it's in the criminal justice arena or elsewhere, keep in mind the saying from the Jewish Talmud that impacting even one life is the equivalent of saving the world. How do I know this? I know this because I met social justice and I've seen it in action. I just didn't catch its name, but I adopted its passion. Thank you, and please continue to fight on the side of justice.